The letter arrived on a Thursday in late October, the kind of day in northern Ontario when the maples have already given up their color, and the sky sits low and gray, like a lid pressed down on the world. We want to tell you about a young woman named Tilda Rowe. She was 22 years old when that letter found her, and she was standing at the workbench in her late teacher's forge, a low-ceilinged building behind the main house in Millhaven. With her hands still black from the morning's work, she heard the knock at the door of the main house, then voices, and then the particular silence that follows bad news. She knew that silence. She had grown up inside it. Tilda set down the ball-peen hammer she had been holding and wiped her palms on her apron. The hammer was old, its handle worn smooth at the grip from years of use, its head slightly off-round from 1,000 strikes against iron. It had belonged to Edmund Hale, the blacksmith and metalworker who had taken her on as an apprentice 4 years before, who had taught her the difference between hardening and tempering, between a good weld and a cold one, between metal that would hold and metal that was merely pretending. Edmund Hale had died in August, quietly and without warning, a stroke that found him in his sleep and left behind his forge, his tools, his house, and a sizable debt to a man named Councillor Gerard Foss. The woman who appeared at the forge door a few minutes later was Edmund's daughter, Renata Hale, who had arrived from Toronto for the funeral and stayed on to settle the estate. She was 43, efficient, and not unkind, but she had a life elsewhere and no room in it for complications. She held the letter at her side. "It's from Foss," she said. His solicitor, rather. Tilda already knew. Councillor Gerard Foss had been to the house twice since the funeral, each time with the practiced sympathy of a man who had delivered such news before and found it profitable. The debt Edmund had owed him was legitimate. A loan for the new bellows system and the roof repairs, signed and witnessed. The forge itself, together with the land it sat on, was the collateral. Tilda understood all of this. What she had not fully calculated until this moment was what it meant for her. "They're giving me 3 weeks," Renata said. She paused. "There's nothing I can do about the forge. I've tried." Tilda looked at the bench, at the hammer, at the small iron bracket she had been shaping that morning for a client who needed hinges for a barn door, work she would now never finish. "I understand," she said, and she did, and that was almost the worst of it. The perfect reasonableness of her own erasure. She was not Edmund's blood. She had no legal claim to the tools she had spent 4 years learning to use, to the trade she had spent those same years building into something real. She boarded in the back room of the forge. She ate meals in the main house. She had been, in the eyes of the law, and the letter from Councillor Gerard Foss's solicitor, a guest who had outstayed her welcome. Renata left for Toronto the following weekend. She pressed $40 into Tilda's hand at the door of the truck, a gesture of genuine guilt that Tilda accepted without comment. Then she was alone. That night, Tilda sat on the cot in the back room of the forge and listed her assets on the back of an envelope. $40 from Renata, $62 and some change she had saved from the small wages Edmund had paid her, careful money set aside over 3 years of careful living. $102 in total. The clothes she owned. A box of books Edmund had given her, mostly technical, metallurgy, joinery, a battered copy of a provincial surveyor's manual from 1947 that he had kept for reasons he never fully explained. And the hammer. She had asked Renata if she could keep it, and Renata had said yes without hesitation, as though giving away a dead man's favorite tool was a kindness and not a wound. On the other side of the envelope, she wrote her situation plainly. No family. Her mother had died when Tilda was 11, her father 2 years before that. And the aunt who had taken her in had done so with the patience of someone keeping a debt ledger. When Tilda was 17, she had walked out of that house in Sudbury with a garbage bag of clothes and no particular plan, and Edmund Hale, who had known her father slightly, who had needed an extra set of hands, who seemed to make decisions with his gut rather than his head, had taken her on. That was the whole of her biography. She had no network, no references that mattered outside of Millhaven. And in Millhaven the work was mining adjacent or retail, and neither wanted her. She could go back to Sudbury. She knew the city well enough to dislike it. She could try Thunder Bay, maybe Ottawa, some larger place with more opportunities and more people competing for each one. $102 would get her there and feed her for perhaps 6 weeks if she was careful. After that, she would need to have found something. And finding something in a city where no one knew her work would depend entirely on her being able to show it. A blacksmith without a forge was a story without evidence. She looked at the list for a long time. Then she looked at the hammer on the bench beside her. She had nowhere to go, but she had been told, once, about somewhere she might be able to start. Edmund had mentioned it only in passing, on an afternoon, in her second year, when they had driven north for a delivery, and he had taken a side road on a whim, up into the Canadian Shield, where the rock pushed through the thin soil like old bones. He had stopped the truck and pointed through the trees to where a low stone building sat at the edge of a small lake, half hidden by birch and jack pine. That was old Callum Strath's place, he had said. Callum Strath, the man who had taught Edmund the trade, a blacksmith and millwright, who had apparently built the structure himself in the 1950s from field stone and salvaged timber. He had used it as a workshop, then as a camp, then as a place to be old in. He had died in 1991, and the land had reverted to the Crown, some kind of tax situation that had never been fully resolved. Nobody owns it, Edmund had said, almost amused. Nobody wants it. Rock and scrub and one very stubborn building. He had paused. Good bones, though. Old Callum knew how to stack stone. Tilda had filed it away and forgotten it, the way you file away things that have no immediate use. But now, sitting in a forge she would have to vacate in 3 weeks, she took it back out and turned it over in her mind. She found the side road on her second attempt, with Edmund's old surveyor's manual, open on the passenger seat beside her, and a hand-drawn sketch she had made from memory. The truck she had borrowed from the man down the road who owed her a favor. She had repaired his tractor hitch twice, and never asked for more than gas money. She drove north until the road narrowed to gravel, then to 2 ruts through yellowing grass, and then she saw the birch trees Edmund had pointed at, their trunks white and slender against the dark spruce behind them. The building was smaller than she remembered from a distance, or perhaps it was only that it sat so naturally in the landscape that it refused to assert itself. It was roughly 20 feet long and 14 wide, built from rough-cut granite fieldstone, laid in courses that were uneven but solid, the mortar long since crumbled out of most of the joints. The roof was corrugate metal, orange with rust in places but still attached, still sloped correctly to shed snow. The door was a plank of old spruce, its surface gray and furred from decades of weather, hung on iron hinges that had seized with rust. The single window on the south wall had lost its glass but not its frame. She pushed the door open with her shoulder and went inside. The floor was packed earth, dry and firm. The south-facing window let in the low afternoon light in a long rectangle across the ground, and she stood in it for a moment, like something thawing. The interior smelled of cold stone and old ash. Against the north wall, a simple iron firebox sat on a raised stone hearth, its pipe vanishing into a stone chimney that ran up through the roof. She knocked on the pipe. It rang solid. She looked up the flue and saw a circle of gray sky. She walked the perimeter. The east wall was the strongest, 2 feet thick, and anchored against the shield bedrock that rose there like a shelf. The west wall had a few loose stones near the top, but the courses below them were tight. She ran her hand along the north wall and found a crack she could fit 2 fingers into, but when she pressed, nothing moved. Old Callum had known what he was doing. The walls had survived 30 years of unheated northern winters, and they would survive more. She stood in the center of the room and looked at the south window, at the way the light came through it directly, warming the stone floor. This was not an accident. Callum Strath had built this with a craftsman's deliberateness, orienting the window to catch winter sun, building the thermal mass of the stone walls to hold whatever warmth could be gathered. Edmund had taught her to think about metal that way, about how it held heat, how it released it, about the relationship between mass and temperature. She was looking at the same principle in stone. This could work. The thought came quietly, without drama. Not this could work if everything goes right, but simply, this could work. The structure was sound. The chimney functioned. The shield rock on the east side would act as a wall all its own, a continuation of the building's mass. The south window could be reglazed. The door could be repaired. The stone joints could be repointed with a lime mortar she could mix herself. She drove back to Millhaven with the surveyor's manual on the seat beside her, and something that was not quite hope but was adjacent to it. A coldness that had come unfrozen, a small, precise sense of direction. She had 3 weeks to prepare, and she used every day of them. You have to understand what those 3 weeks looked like, if you want to understand who Tilda Rowe is. She did not approach this the way someone approaches a temporary solution. She approached it the way Edmund had taught her to approach a difficult piece of work. With patience, with a plan made on paper first, and with the understanding that iron does not forgive carelessness. Her $102 had to last. She made a list, organized by necessity. First, materials to make the building weatherproof for a hard Ontario winter. Second, food and fuel for at minimum 5 months. Third, tools she could not do without, the hammer she already had. From the forge, before she left it for the last time, she took only what Renata had explicitly released to her, a small set of hand tools that had been her personal kit, a draw knife, a set of files, 2 punches. She did not take what was not hers to take. At the salvage yard in Millhaven, she found 2 pieces of window glass, the right size for under $3, some bags of dried mortar mix at $1.50 each, and a length of stovepipe to extend the flue by 4 feet. At the hardware store she bought caulk, screws, a box of roofing nails, and a tube of high-temperature furnace cement for sealing the firebox joints. She spent the rest on food: oats, flour, dried beans, lentils, salt pork, coffee, oil, salt. She bought a 50-pound sack of oats from the feed store for the camp stove she borrowed, and then, on second thought, went back and bought another. Winter was longer than optimism. She made 4 trips to the stone building before she moved in, hauling supplies in the borrowed truck. On each visit, she worked on the structure itself. She repointed the worst of the west wall joints with the mortar mix, pressing the material in with her fingers where the gaps were widest. She climbed onto the roof and hammered down the loose sheets of corrugated metal. She reset the glass in the window frame with caulk and screwed a piece of clear plastic sheeting over the outside of it for an extra layer. She repaired the door with 2 new hinges she forged herself in the last days at Edmund's forge, sitting with the old forge lit one final time, working by habit and by heart, making the hinges heavier and truer than strictly necessary because Edmund had taught her that doing a thing right the first time saved you the grief of doing it twice. On the last day in Millhaven, she loaded the borrowed truck and drove north. She did not look back at the forge either. She had learned that from someone. The nights arrived earlier every week, and they arrived cold. The first morning she woke in the stone building. Her breath was visible, and the temperature on the small thermometer she had hung by the door read 3 degrees above zero. Not yet the deep cold, but the deep cold was coming. She had 6 weeks before the lakes froze solid, and she used them with everything she had. Firewood was the first calculation. She had no chainsaw and no money for one. She had a handsaw and a splitting maul she had borrowed, and she had the deadfall birch and poplar that lay in abundance in the scrubs around the lake, wood already dried by years of standing dead. She cut and split for 3 hours every morning, then stacked the rounds inside the east end of the building, away from the window and door, building the pile against the cold stone like a second wall. She had worked out that at a conservative burn rate, she would need roughly 4 cubic meters of hardwood to last to April. The pile grew daily, a visible argument against despair. She repointed the chimney cap with furnace cement on a day warm enough to let it cure. She stuffed the gap under the door with a rolled length of old canvas and sealed the window frame edges a second time. She banked soil against the north wall, up to 2 feet high, an old farmhouse trick she had read about in one of Edmund's books, using the earth as insulation against the wind that came without mercy from that direction. The lake provided water, carried in buckets until the ice came, after which she learned to cut a hole each morning with an ice bar she fashioned from a length of rebar and the head of a broken garden pick, welded together over a wood fire in a way that was imprecise but functional. It held. She had learned from Edmund that holding is often enough. She ate simply and precisely. A cup of oats with dried fruit in the morning, flatbread and bean soup for the midday meal, lentils cooked with salt pork in the evening, thick and filling, fuel for the body in the same way the birch rounds were fuel for the firebox. She allowed herself 1 mug of coffee each morning, black, taken standing by the south window, where the early light came in low and strong across the lake. She had begun to love that light in a way that felt like the first real thing she had loved in years. Not a person, not a place, but a quality of illumination at a specific time of day that asked nothing from her. The tools were the problem she had not fully solved before arriving. She could do finish work with her hand tools, fine filing, small repairs, the kind of detail work that required patience and a good eye. She had been doing it through the autumn, picking up small commissions from farms and homesteads within driving distance, driving the borrowed truck which she had now, with the owner's increasingly resigned permission, borrowed indefinitely. She fixed hinges and sharpened blades and repaired a hay rake and fabricated a replacement latch for a dairy barn door. She charged fairly and delivered on time, and a few people in the scattered community north of Millhaven began to know her name. But without a forge, she could not do the work that commanded real money. She could not fabricate, could not weld, could not work with raw stock. She was a seamstress with thread but no needle. She had been turning this over for weeks when she first met Gwen Ashford. Gwen Ashford was a retired millwright, 61 years old, who lived on a property 6 kilometers north of the stone building, with a workshop that contained, among other things, a propane forge she had not lit in 4 years. She came to Tilda not for metalwork, but because she had heard there was a young woman living in Callum Strath's old place who could be trusted. And she needed someone trustworthy to help her clear the brush from her driveway before the winter made it impassable. Tilda spent a Saturday doing it. Gwen Ashford fed her lunch, thick soup, fresh bread, slabs of cheddar, and watched her work with the quiet attention of someone who understood the difference between a person going through the motions and a person who meant it. "What do you actually do?" Gwen asked over the soup. "Metal work," Tilda said. "I trained under Edmund Hale in Millhaven 4 years. There was a pause of recognition. I knew Edmund slightly. Good man, he was." Gwen looked at her, not the way people often looked at Tilda, assessing her youth, her gender, her visible lack of resources, but the way Edmund had looked at a piece of work before he committed to it, asking whether it was worth the effort. "I have a forge I'm not using," she said. "Come and see it." The propane forge was a good one, a floor-standing unit with a forced air burner and a proper fire brick interior. It needed a new igniter, and one of the burner ports was partially blocked. Both things Tilda diagnosed in under 10 minutes and fixed in under an hour, using tools from Gwen's own workshop and the contents of her own kit. She lit the forge and let it come to temperature, and the two of them stood watching the interior glow come up from red to orange to the pale yellow of working heat. "What would you need to use it regularly?" Gwen asked. Tilda thought. "Stock, access, somewhere to store finished work. I have all of that. What I don't have is anyone to keep this shop functional." She looked around at the workshop, at the dust on the workbenches, at the tools hanging unused on their pegs. "I'm not doing the work anymore. But I don't want the place to go to seed." They came to an arrangement that suited them both. Tilda would have full use of the forge and workshop in exchange for 3 days a week, keeping the shop maintained, the equipment serviced, and the driveway clear of snow. The remaining 4 days were her own to take commissions. It was not a wage. It was better than a wage. It was a foundation. We think about that moment sometimes. When a single conversation between two people who have earned each other's respect opens a door that the whole weight of circumstance had been holding shut. It is worth pausing on, before we go further, to ask, when was the last time you trusted someone based on the quality of their work rather than what they could offer you? Gwen Ashford did not know Tilda Rowe's history. She saw her clear a driveway and eat soup without complaint and speak about her trade without exaggerating. And she made a decision. It cost her nothing but the use of something she wasn't using. It changed everything. The winter came the way it always comes in northern Ontario. Not all at once, but in a series of deliberate escalations, each one testing what you've done to prepare, and the next one testing it harder. The first real cold arrived in December. The thermometer outside the stone building read -22 on a Wednesday morning and did not rise above -15 for 11 days. The lake was solid. The birch trees snapped and popped in the night, a sound like distant rifle shots. The moisture in the wood, turning to ice and splitting the grain. Tilda woke each morning before the light, added wood to the firebox, and waited in her sleeping bag, while the stone walls began their slow work of returning the heat they had stored the day before. The waiting was not nothing. She had learned to count it as time well spent. The firebox, she found, was more efficient than she had projected. The stone walls held the warmth for hours after the fire was banked, exactly as Edmund had described passive thermal mass in a lecture she had half listened to at the time. She was burning less wood than she had budgeted for, which meant her pile would carry her past April and possibly to May. This discovery felt like finding money. She kept records, the way Edmund had always kept records, in the margins of the old surveyor's manual, the only blank paper she had ready to hand. She noted the daily temperature, the wood consumption, the state of the ice, the jobs she had taken and completed, the money she had made and spent. The manual was filling with her own handwriting, alongside the printed survey data, 2 layers of information about the same unforgiving landscape. In January, the temperature went to -31 and stayed there for a week. On the second day, she could not get the truck started and walked the 6 kilometers to Gwen Ashford's workshop, through the snow, with her kit bag on her back, because she had promised work, and she delivered on promises. Gwen met her at the door with coffee and the particular look of someone who has decided, without announcing it, to respect another person completely. "You walked," she said. "Truck's out," Tilda said. "I'll fix it when it's warmer." Gwen shook her head slowly. She did not say what she was thinking. She did not need to. By February, something had shifted in the community north of Millhaven. Word travels in rural places, not quickly, but with a thoroughness that urban gossip cannot match. People knew about the young woman in Callum Strath's old building. They knew she had come with nothing and made the place livable. They knew she did good metal work, that she charged fairly, that she showed up. Farmers began driving to her, or rather to Gwen's workshop, which Tilda was using on the non-maintenance days, with problems she had the training to solve, a custom fitting for a grain auger. Replacement parts for a piece of equipment, discontinued in the 1980s, that she had to fabricate from scratch, measuring the broken original and working from measurements, because there were no plans. A set of fireplace tools for a family in Temagami who had seen her work at their neighbor's farm. She was not yet comfortable. She was not eating well enough, and the cold wore on her in ways she could feel in her joints in the morning. But she was making money, and she was spending almost none of it. The counselor arrived in March. Counselor Gerard Foss drove a truck that was too large a road to Callum Strath's old building, and he parked it badly on the verge and walked the last 100 meters to her door with the expression of a man who expects to be thanked for making the trip. He was in his mid-50s, well-fed and warmly dressed, the kind of man whose authority derived from a title and a ledger rather than from anything he had built with his hands. He had heard, through whatever circuit such men maintained, that the girl Edmund Hale had taken in was up north somewhere doing well enough. Tilda did not ask him inside. "You're living on Crown land," he said by way of opening. He had clearly been advised to say this. Technically, that's an illegal occupation. Technically, the building has been there since 1954, and the Crown has made no claim on it in 70 years, Tilda said. She had spent an evening at Gwen Ashford's with a laptop researching exactly this question. The night after, a neighbor had mentioned seeing Foss in Millhaven asking about her. Under the Limitations Act and recent case law on adverse possession in Ontario, the situation is complicated enough that you would need to spend more on lawyers than the land is worth. He looked at her. She could see him revising something in his mind. "I was thinking," he said, "in a different register now, that you might be interested in an arrangement. I have properties in the north that need maintenance. Metalwork repairs, that kind of thing. I could offer you proper wages." "I have proper wages," she said. "I could offer you title to this building." She looked at him for a moment. The cold air moved between them. She had already spoken to a Crown land surveyor, a woman she had found through Gwen's network, who had visited in February and walked the property and told Tilda that the parcel had been flagged in 2019 as eligible for a heritage occupancy designation on account of the building's age and the documented connection to Callum Strath, who was recorded in the township's unofficial history as a skilled tradesman and community figure. An application for a nominal long-term lease was possible. It was not guaranteed, but it was a path, and it was a path Tilda had already begun to walk. She had submitted the paperwork in late January, with a letter of support from Gwen Ashford and a second from the Millhaven Historical Society, which had been surprised to learn anyone remembered Callum Strath, and pleased to say so in writing. She didn't say any of this to Councillor Gerard Foss. "I'll think about it," she said. And then she went back inside and closed the door. She did not think about it. She had nothing to think about. The lease approval came in April. A 50-year nominal lease at $1 per year, formalized through the provincial office, the stone building and the parcel it sat on, now hers to occupy and maintain for longer than she was likely to need it. The letter arrived at Gwen Ashford's address, since that was the one she had given, and Gwen called her on the radio they had set up between the two properties for emergencies, her voice carrying a warmth across the static that Tilda had learned to recognize as the closest Gwen came to celebration. She put the letter in the surveyor's manual between 2 pages of watershed survey data and went back to work. That spring, the road to Callum Strath's building became passable again, and people found her. A journalist from a regional paper in Sudbury had heard the story from someone who had heard it from someone else. The young woman who had been left with nothing, who had spent a winter alone in a stone building in the Shield, who now had a legitimate lease and a growing metalwork practice. Tilda agreed to speak with her on the condition that the article was about the work, and not about Councillor Gerard Foss, whose name she had no interest in reading in print. The journalist agreed, and the article was a careful, practical piece about traditional metalwork and about what it took to establish a trade practice in rural northern Ontario. It brought 2 new clients the week it ran. The week after, it brought 4 more. Gwen Ashford came to the stone building that May for the first time, arriving on a dry afternoon when the ice was fully off the lake and the birches were in new leaf, that urgent spring green that only lasts a few weeks before it deepens into summer. She stood inside and looked at what Tilda had done over the winter. The repointed walls, the proper door with its new forged hinges, the orderly stacks of finished work waiting for collection, the surveyor's manual open on the workbench beside the ball-peen hammer. Old Callum would approve, Gwen said. It was not a small thing to say. Tilda understood that. She had begun, that spring, to keep her own technical notes in a second notebook, a practice journal she had started on a whim and continued out of habit. She wrote down the jobs she took, and the problems they presented, and the solutions she found, the way Edmund had kept his forge records. She wrote about the thermal behavior of the stone walls in the cold, about which wood burned hottest and which burned longest, about the ice patterns on the lake that told her something about the geography of the lakebed beneath. She was building, without intending to, a record of her first year in a place that was becoming, cautiously and irreversibly, hers. She was not the kind of person who gave speeches or drew lessons out loud from her own experience. She would not have told you what she had proven or what it meant. But if you had asked her what she had kept from that first winter in the stone building, she might have said, the hammer and the habit of watching closely, and the knowledge that the difference between a structure that holds and one that fails is almost always in the preparation you do before anyone is watching. She had not been given anything that mattered. But she had not lost it either. The thing Edmund Hale had handed her, imperfectly and generously, in the form of 4 years and one worn hammer. She had carried it north and put it to work. That is, in the end, the kind of inheritance that cannot be evicted. And we'll ask you to think about that. Whether there is something you've been carrying that you haven't yet found the right use for. Something a person left with you, in the form of time or patience, or a skill they taught you on an ordinary afternoon, that you set down somewhere and haven't yet picked back up. Because if Tilda Rowe's first winter in the Canadian Shield proved anything, it is that the right tool, in the right hands, in the right moment is enough to begin.